Theodosius' forces breathing down Italy's neck, the powers that be in Aquileia decided that standing behind Maximus was suicide, whereas handing him over likely meant they would escape all this with their heads intact. So, they thought it over for roughly 2 nanoseconds and put Maximus in chains. When Theodosius' forces arrived, Maximus was handed over, and on August 28, 388 AD, General was beheaded. I'll never quite be sure what his official title was, but he did rule the western provinces for 5 years, and by all accounts did a pretty good job. And now he's dead, so there you go. With Maximus dead, Theodosius entered Milan unopposed, and then called on Valentinian and the rest of his exiled court to return. The war over, securing the peace was now the main task confronting the victorious Theodosius, and, as in his dealings with the Goths, the Eastern Augustus demonstrated that he found clemency and forgiveness far superior tools to work with than hostility and revenge. Almost no punitive action was taken against the men who had sided with Maximus, and even within the general's own family, only his eldest son, who had been named Maximus's official co-ruler and successor, paid the ultimate price for the general's transgressions. His wife and daughters were allowed to live out their lives in peace, their security guaranteed. As Julius Caesar had shown so many years before, this sort of habitual blanket clemency can sometimes come back to bite you, but Theodosius likely felt like the alternative would have been far worse. It's not like Maximus had been unpopular with either the people or the military. Going after his supporters would have meant, well, going after everyone, really. Then guarantee one now by coming down too harshly. Aside from the people and the soldiers of the West, there was one other major player that Theodosius was keen to placate: the Bishop of Milan. Ambrose had stayed behind when the imperial court had abandoned the Italian capital to Maximus, and his steadfast refusal to be pushed around had elevated his popularity, and he was already pretty popular, into the stratosphere. Not that staying took some immense amount of courage or anything. If Ambrose felt he had a thing to fear from the devoutly Nicene Maximus, he probably would have hightailed it out of there. But he didn't, and so he didn't. Theodosius understood that the road to a secure Western Empire went right through the bishop's church, and so he reached out to Ambrose in an attempt to bring the influential clergyman over to his side. But Theodosius was about to discover that Ambrose was the kind of man who, while willing to make deals, was only willing to make them on his own terms. Thoroughly empowered and not at all impressed by imperial displays of power, Ambrose had no intention of compromising with Theodosius on anything. The emperor was going to have to come to him. Theodosius caught his first whiff of Ambrose's willingness to go head-to-head with an imperial court when news came that far in the east, some fanatical monks had talked themselves up into a righteous fury, and then decided to go take that fury out on an ancient Jewish synagogue. Theodosius, you'll recall, usually reserved his own religious fanaticism for intra-Christian conflicts and skewed tolerant when other religions were involved. When he learned of the monks' crime, the emperor ordered them to pay to have the synagogue rebuilt. It seemed like this was a routine bit of law and order. Private property had been destroyed, everyone knew who had done it, and so the vandals, not that we can really call them that yet, ought to pay for the repairs. Okay, what's next? So Theodosius was shocked when Ambrose took to his pulpit and denounced the emperor's decision in extremely harsh language. Taken aback by the assault, the emperor modified his decision, ordering the whole civic community in question to help rebuild the synagogue, rather than focusing solely on the monks. But Ambrose continued to take offense, asking his congregation why a single public dollar should go toward building a temple for sacrilegious Jews, and then asking further, hey, why aren't we giving that money to the monks as a reward for the good work that they've done? Theodosius was shocked by the bishop's demagoguing on the issue, but with the people of Milan raised up now into a mighty rabble, the emperor decided to just cut bait. the order to rebuild the synagogue was quietly dropped. Ambrose had once again stared down the imperial court and won. But his best was still to come. Despite the shot that Ambrose had just fired across his bow, Theodosius was not ready to become an anti-all-other-religions kind of Christian just yet. In June of 389, he traveled down to Rome to secure the support of the old Roman Senate, and flashing around a bunch of extremist Christian rhetoric wasn't going to get him anywhere. Instead, he engaged in a very low-key charm offensive designed to set the senators' minds at ease. While in the city, he made a habit of dropping the most ostentatious bits of his imperial regalia and leave behind his military escorts when he called on senators at their homes. For a brief moment there, Theodosius seemed to return to the princeps model and presented himself as a man, a leader, and an honorable soldier, rather than a warlord and a living god. The charm offensive did the trick, and the Senate fell over itself praising Theodosius and promising their complete support. The emperor's reasonable front was so comforting that the great senator Symmachus even took the opportunity to ask that the sacred altar of victory be restored. But that went a little too far, and Theodosius firmly, though politely, refused. These happy times would not last, however, as events were about to overtake them all, giving Ambrose the leverage he needed to really bend the emperor over the cross. The bishop had been chafing a little bit since Theodosius' arrival in Italy, because while the emperor clearly desired an alliance with the Church of Milan, he was not proving nearly as pliable as Gratian or Valentinian II. The young emperors had been more than willing to bring Ambrose in on their inner circle discussions of policy, making the bishop practically a minister of state. But Theodosius had his own inner circle of advisors, and ever since the defeat of Maximus, Ambrose had found himself on the outside looking in. Hence the need to take to the pulpit on the synagogue question, rather than just saying in a meeting, "No, we won't be doing that." Sure, he had spies all over Theodosius' court, and was kept fully briefed on what was going on, but he had lost the direct power he'd enjoyed for the last decade. The bishop didn't want to simply be an ally of the imperial court, he wanted to be indistinguishable from it. And so what he needed was a way to drive himself back into the center of the action. In 390, Theodosius' temper got the better of him, and Ambrose immediately recognized the resulting PR debacle as the opportunity he had been looking for. The citizens of the key port city of Thessalonica, like most of the citizens of the empire, loved chariot racing. And I mean loved chariot racing. I'm not sure there's any modern sport, football included, that quite touches the salivating obsession exhibited by chariot racing fans in late antiquity. Part of it was because racing was essentially the only sport going. They didn't have dozens of options to choose from, so if you were the type of person who was into the thrill of competition, rooting for one team, hating another team, or had any interest at all in gambling, well, then chariot racing was going to be your thing. Your only thing. So one day, the biggest chariot racing star is of homosexual rape. Locked up in a cell, he is now going to miss the big race, which causes the good citizens of Thessalonica to go a little crazy. Now, there was definitely more going on here than just the loss of a big star on race day. Since heading west, Theodosius had left the city garrisoned by a small contingent of allied Gothic soldiers, which did not sit well with the public, and it was the Gothic captain of this Gothic garrison who was behind the arrest, which really did not sit well with the public. In their book, Theodosius and the Empire at Bay, Stephen Williams and Gerald Friel point out that this meant there were really three factors behind the coming riots at Thessalonica. First was general resentment over the presence of Gothic soldiers in the city. Sure, at the top levels, alliances shifted with the winds these days, but down on the mass level, well, hadn't the Goths just been rampaging through our lands like just the other day? wounds did not heal as quickly down here as they did in the corridors of power. Second was the temperamental difference between the Greeks and the Goths when it came to the question of homosexuality. The former had no real problem with it, while the latter considered it a fairly heinous offense. Locking up a star charioteer for homosexual activity, then, was an obnoxious imposition of barbarian sensibility on Greek manners, and now doubly so given the circumstances. The third factor was that, well, yeah, they were all pissed that the charioteer was going to be sitting in a cell on race day. The people of Thessalonica began to get hostile, and pretty soon a riot broke out. The Gothic garrison wasn't nearly strong enough to get a handle on the mob, and they were quickly overrun. The Gothic captain behind the arrest, and most of his fellow officers, were tracked down, killed, and their bodies dragged through the streets. News quickly reached Theodosius in Milan about what had happened, and he exploded with rage. The Gothic captain had been a trusted and loyal officer, as evidenced by the fact that he had been given command over the key city of Thessalonica, and his murder by some race-crazed mob made Theodosius furious. Murderously furious. Before he could sleep on his anger, he sent orders off to the commander of the new and large garrison being brought in the wake of the riot. The orders were as clear as they were evil. When the citizens of Thessalonica next filled up their hippodrome for a big race, the new garrison came down, locked all the doors, and then marched out into the crowd, swords drawn. Theodosius's orders had been plain: indiscriminate slaughter. The troops did their bloody work efficiently, and pretty soon over 7,000 men, women, and children were dead. Even in the callous days of late antiquity, a time when life was cheap, the massacre of Thessalonica appalled the citizens of the empire. Even Theodosius understood that he had gone too far, which is why, after sending out his initial order, he sent on another countermanding it, which of course arrived too late, which meant that the emperor, author of the massacre, wound up as appalled as anyone that it had actually taken place. When Ambrose learned of what had happened, he immediately pulled up stakes and left Milan for the countryside to consider his next move. The bishop knew that the emperor had just committed a grievous sin, that the emperor furthermore was a religious man, and that meant that Ambrose had an opportunity to leverage the emperor's guilt into something profitable. But rather than climb back up onto his bully pulpit, Ambrose was savvy enough to try a different tactic. He wrote the emperor a personal letter, saying that unfortunately he would be unable to celebrate Mass with Theodosius present until the emperor had publicly atoned for his sin. Ambrose was careful to say that he was not angry at the emperor, and that this was not a punishment, instead saying that he was only doing what had to be done, and that he was in anguish over the damage it might cause to Theodosius' soul. When Ambrose returned to Milan, Theodosius tried to call the bishop's bluff, but when he approached Ambrose's church, the bishop held fast, refusing the emperor entry. The honestly Christian Theodosius allowed himself to be turned away, and then proceeded to go into seclusion, remorseful over what he had done, and now deeply concerned over the fate of his immortal soul. He kept up a personal correspondence with Ambrose where the bishop again pressed him to publicly atone for his sin. How exactly the emperor might